I just want to clarify what I'm going to be talking about, give you a brief outline of the talk to help you follow it. To my knowledge, this is the first Mises University with this specific lecture, and so what I'm interpreting the suggested title to mean is that I'm going to try to give you, in a single place, a side-by-side comparison of the Austrians versus what's called the Neoclassicals on several different points, and we'll get to that later on in the lecture, because for those of you especially who are new to this, probably during the week you're going to be hearing or have heard the speakers talk about what the Austrian view is, and then to clarify what it is, they contrast it with the neoclassical view. And so for some of you who have never heard these terms before, you're probably not sure what they're talking about, so that's what I'm going to be doing today. So I apologize for those of you who may be in grad school that some of what I say is going to be fairly old hat to you, but nonetheless I think it's important that in a series like this to clarify what we mean and who these bad neoclassicals are. And because of this fact, there's going to be built in at the end a Q&A session, because a lot of the stuff I planned on talking about the other speakers have already touched on, and so I don't really need to explain the point too deeply. I just want to mention the Austrian view, and then I'm going to elaborate more on the neoclassical counterpoint on whatever the relevant issue is, because clearly during this week you're going to hear what the Austrian view is. So I'm going to focus more on the neoclassical side during this talk, just so you understand where they're coming from, so you can understand the enemy if that's the mentality you want. But in the interest of brevity, I'm not going to critique them too heavily here. I just want to show you what they do and where they're coming from. Now, the first thing that's a bit problematic when you want to deal with a topic like this is how do you define the term neoclassical, because it's sort of like pornography, that it's hard to give a definition of it, but we all know neoclassical when we see it. And that's as far as the analogy goes. I don't mean to suggest anything deeper than that. Because I went to Google and I typed in neoclassical economics, and the first site that I went to was one run by the New School, and they have a great history of economic thought compendium of things online that I always go to whenever I'm going to prepare a lecture in the history of thought, just to check to see, to make sure that my view is at least consistent with what some other people are saying. And as they define neoclassical, it's basically the classical school of economics with the insights of the marginalist or subjectivist revolution. So what Dr. Salerno already talked to you about, the first main lecture of this week. And in that sense, of course, the Austrians would be considered neoclassical. So what do I mean in particular? That in this broad sense, a neoclassical is anybody who explains prices in a market economy as determined by marginal utility for consumer goods, and then marginal productivity determines the prices of producer goods or factors of production. And so, as I say, the Austrians agree with that also, and so if that's the umbrella you're going to use for what a neoclassical is, then an Austrian economist is a neoclassical. And you would include Menger and all of his followers with Jevons and Walras and all of their descendants as well, and say, oh, those are all the neoclassicals. And just so you can understand, well, who doesn't think that? Who would not be a neoclassical, at least in modern times? Well, there are some schools of thought. For example, if you're at all a Marxist, then you don't think wage rates are determined by the marginal productivity of labor. You don't think that the worker receives in compensation what he or she contributes to the production process. And rather, you think the worker gets paid less than what they contribute, because the capitalist, of course, siphons off some of that product in the form of profit. And so the workers are all getting paid less than what they contribute. So if you're a Marxist, you don't believe in neoclassical price theory. Now, another example would be if you've heard of Piero Sraffa and his disciples, and they're called Neo-Ricardians, and they also dispute the claim by the neoclassicals that prices are determined by marginal principles. And in particular, they're going to say, no, the interest return on capital is not at all due to marginal principles, whether the productivity of capital, if you're of Chicago or other schools of thought, or even due to people's subjective time preferences if you're an Austrian. Whatever the explanation, those two, what they share in common is that they think the interest rate is determined, as other prices are, due to marginal principles, people deciding things on the margin, whereas the Sraffians dispute that, and they think, no, the interest rate is about exploitation, and it's about the fact that society, the institutions we have, the capitalists, have a certain degree of exploitive power, and so they sort of determine that they're going to get an interest return, and that's the way the explanation proceeds. Okay, so what I'm trying to get across is that the Austrians are not so different from other schools of thought, such as the Chicago School and public choicers, and even Walrasian general equilibrium theorists, insofar as they all generally endorse the subjectivist marginalist revolution starting in 1871 that Dr. Salerno told you about. So, of course, if I'm supposed to be talking about the two schools versus each other, we can't use that broad sense, so there's a narrower sense. But before I get into that, where we can see a true distinction, I don't want to leave this point. Let me just reiterate again this fundamental distinction between the classical way of thinking and the neoclassical, meaning the new classical way of thinking. And so again, just that very term, it's to suggest that, look, it's not completely overturning classical economics. It's not that we're saying the classical economists, again, by which we mean people like Adam Smith and David Ricardo and John Stuart Mill, we're not saying they were completely wrong and they didn't know what they were talking about, but we're saying they were wrong in a fundamental sense when it came to value theory, and so that's why we're neoclassicals in the broad sense, and we understand marginal subjectivist principles. So let me just give you a quick example to take away so that in case you didn't quite understand everything Dr. Salerno was saying, that maybe this will help you just remember the difference, is that if you've got some people and they're going to a Broadway play, let's say, and they come out of the show and they go to a coffee shop that's right on Broadway and it's right on the corner, a real busy intersection, and they go in there and the cup of coffee is $5, let's say. And you can imagine if some of them from out of town, they could be aghast at this and say, gee, for the same cup of coffee back home, that would have cost $1.50 tops. This is outrageous. I can't believe how much it cost. Now, somebody in the group might say, to try to defend the pricing policy, might say, well, no, they have to charge that much because can you imagine what the rental rate is for this property? To have a corner location right on Broadway, that it's going to be really expensive. And so if they were charging $1.50 per cup of coffee, they'd go out of business. So it has to be that expensive. All right, so that's a very classical way, and of course the classical economists would be much more sophisticated, but that's the general idea, that prices are what they are because you have to at least be able to pay for your costs of production. Whereas after the insights of the marginal revolution, the subjectivist revolution, the answer would run the opposite way. It would say, no, the reason it costs so much, or the price is so high, is that people, when they come out of the Broadway show, they really want to get a cup of coffee or something to eat right away. They don't want to walk 50 blocks, or they don't want to get on a plane and go back to where this guy comes from to get coffee there for $1.50, and so they're willing to pay that much for the cup of coffee, the convenience of having it right there. And so the explanation runs the other way, and in particular you would say as an Austrian that there's a reverse valuation, that the reason somebody gives $5 for the cup of coffee is not because they need to or else the coffee producer would go out of business, but rather the consumer values the cup of coffee more than the $5 bill he's giving up in exchange. So he benefits, and then on the other side of the transaction, the seller values that $5 bill more than that particular cup of coffee he's giving away. So he or she benefits. It's a mutual gain from trade, and that's how you explain the pricing process. Now, of course, the rental rate on that property, that great location, has to do with all those factors. That's something that the economist needs to take into consideration, but the causality runs the exact opposite direction. So it's not that the coffee is expensive because of the high rents, but rather those geographical regions have high rents because people are willing to pay so much for goods sold on those locations. All right, so that's the distinction, and again, if you get into this, it's much more sophisticated in the arguments they have. It's not, for example, that John Stuart Mill was completely ignorant of demand and its role in price formation, and even, I don't want to put words in his mouth, but even George Reisman, who's one of the faculty members this week, is at least very sympathetic to the classical explanation. And there is a tendency sometimes for the pendulum to swing the other way, where people just completely disregard so-called cost influences on price. And so that's the sort of thing that a modern person who is at least skeptical of the subjectivist revolution might bring up and say, well, let's not completely disregard those technological cost considerations. Okay, but I don't want to dwell too long on that, but I just wanted, again, to reiterate this distinction in case you didn't quite get it from Dr. Salerno's lecture. Okay, so now moving on, what do we mean by neoclassical in the more narrow sense, the sense that would exclude Austrian economists? So that this week, when a speaker says, now this is what our view is, blah, 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 and then in contrast, this is what the neoclassicals think, so this is now what I'm going to be talking about for the rest of the lecture right now. It's, rather than, again, trying to give you a definition, I think it's easier if I just run through several points and just try to demonstrate the way they do things versus the way Austrians do things. And even here, it's not so much that neoclassical is a school of thought, it's a broader term. There are several schools of thought that could all be considered neoclassical, even in the narrower sense of the term. So I mentioned it before, but here, the Chicago school, people like Frank Knight all the way through Milton Friedman, the public choice school, people like James Buchanan, people who try to apply standard economic analysis to government behavior, political behavior, and use economic analysis to reach what used to be counterintuitive results in the political sphere. And then also Walrasian general equilibrium theorists. And if you don't know what that term means, just very quickly, it refers to people who are very mathematically inclined. They have very sophisticated mathematical models of the economy. And I think Guido Hulsmann's going to have a talk, or if he already gave it, about general equilibrium theory. So I'll defer to him to explain more what they're about. But when you hear about people talking about really hyper-mathematical models, it's probably a Walrasian theorist that they have in mind. Okay, so those schools would all be considered neoclassical, even in this narrower sense of the term. And another term you could use is just to call them the mainstream. So if you go to any of the, let's say, top 20 graduate doctoral programs in economics right now, at least in the United States, you're going to be learning neoclassical economics. Or if you look at the top 15 journals that have scholarly articles by PhDs in economics where new economic theories are propounded and argued over, then that's all going to be what we mean by neoclassical in this sense. All right, so now that you've got a rough idea of the boundaries and who belongs to what, let me try to be more specific and go through a quick list of various topics or issues and show you the Austrian position versus the neoclassical. So the first point is the methodological position. And let me just go off on a tangent here for a moment. This is one of the things that irks me. The word method and the word methodological or methodology are not the same. And so you shouldn't use the terms interchangeably. So if whatever your method is, that's the way you're doing something, the approach you're using in a paper, you could talk about your method. Whereas if your paper is methodological, that means you're writing about economic method in your paper. Okay, so I see a lot of papers where people say at the beginning, and even people with PhDs, and say, in this paper my methodology will be such and such, when really they mean my method will be. All right, so it's a minor quibble, but just if you really want to sound sophisticated, use those terms correctly, because what happens is people want to sound smart and they use methodology when they mean method, and so anal people like me think, aha, you really don't know what you're talking about. So if that's at all your concern not to have anal people like me to say that, then just watch out. Okay, but so what do I mean here? And again, this difference between methodology, that when the Austrians talk about, when they're not doing their economics, but rather when they're standing back and saying, what really is economics, or what's the proper boundary of economics, or let's talk about economics per se. Let's not apply it or use it, but let's talk about it. That's methodological musings or considerations. And so they're, as Professor Hoppe has talked to you about in the praxeology lecture, they believe in axiomatic deductions. And again, this is review, but just very quickly. So they start with a few axioms, and in particular the action axiom that says humans act. And there are some subsidiary ones that aren't necessarily irrefutable or self-evident, but that any reasonable person would think is true of this world. For example, that labor is more scarce than land, and that labor carries disutility, at least after a certain point. And with those axioms, armed with those building blocks, then you can logically deduce certain propositions, certain conclusions, and so long as your chain of reasoning is valid, then the conclusion is true, assuming the axioms that you started out with were true. All right, so that you don't, in particular, you don't need to go out and test your economic laws. If there's a problem in your body of economic laws, it's not because you didn't go out and conduct enough experiments, it's because you made a mistake in your reasoning. And so there's still a role for collaboration and to have peer review and to have people who disagree with you argue with you, because then they can pore over your results. And for example, if you reach a conclusion that you really like, chances are you might have missed a step in the argument, whereas someone who thinks your conclusion is wrong or just wishes that it weren't true, they're going to look much more critically at your chain of reasoning. And so that's why there's, given fallible economists, there's still a role for a profession there. But that's the way the arguments would proceed. In contrast, the neoclassicals, to the extent that they even worry about methodology, because that's another difference, is that most neoclassicals that I've encountered would think methodology is a waste of time. They would say, let's not be a bunch of philosophers. We went into economics, not philosophy. And instead of sitting back and wondering, well, what would a good paper look like? Why don't you go write a good paper, and then we'll see what it looks like. Right? So that's the mentality among many neoclassicals. Just roll your sleeves up and go do the economics. Don't worry about what are we going to do 10 minutes from now. But to the extent, as I say, that they do try to justify or give a systematic explanation of what is it that we're doing in neoclassical economics, neoclassical again in the narrow sense, it would probably fairly be labeled as some version of positivism. And for sure, Milton Friedman advanced this. He has his essays on positive economics. And so what is this view? What does this say? And again, I'm going to anticipate, I don't think it happened yet, Roderick Long's talk that's Mises versus Friedman on method, I believe, is what the title is. So if what I'm saying in this point interests you, you might want to consider going to that one. I think that's one of the lectures where you have a choice. But in any event, what is Friedman's position, or more generally the neoclassical position on this point, is that they think that, look, we can't know certain things for sure. So the Austrians are pretty confident in their sort of abstract general conclusions. For example, that when somebody chooses, he or she picks the option that gives the highest ex ante utility, that's a tautology in a sense, that it's necessarily true, and you can't go around looking for people who choose things that they themselves think is going to give them lower utility. That wouldn't make sense. And in contrast to that, the positivist view says, no, that's very arrogant, and you're not realizing that everything that we believe could be false. And so in contrast, what we need to do is, let's copy the methods of the natural sciences. And incidentally, this little story I'm going to give you about how physics works, if you read up in the philosophy of science, they're going to say even physicists don't really do what I'm about to tell you, but mainstream economists think this is what the physicists do, and so they're going to copy the physicists even though they're not really copying them. So the standard story, and you probably learned this in school about what's the scientific method. It's that you have some natural phenomenon that you want to understand, and so what do? You get your data, your observations, or you run your experiments if it's something where an experiment is possible, because in astronomy, for example, you can't really conduct an experiment, but you can certainly collect a lot of observations. And then you have a conjecture, a hypothesis, that certain causal relationships you think exist out there in terms of natural physical law, but you could be wrong. And so how do you determine whether you think you're right or you're wrong? Well, you say, okay, if my conjecture were true, then these things would happen. If I saw such and such conditions at time 1, then at time 2, we would observe such and such. And so let's go try to set up those initial conditions, and then we'll observe, and if we see the predicted results, well, that's a good mark for our theory. And in particular, if we see something other than what we predicted that we thought we would see, then something's wrong. Either we did the experiment wrong, or our theory is at best incomplete. So that's the view, that's what the positivist, naive view of physics is, or other natural sciences, and that's what economists think that economics needs to be like in order to be like physics, okay? Because everybody acknowledges that economics has not been as successful as the natural sciences have been, and we still can't cure business cycles, and we thought we had it down there for a while, but then there was stagflation in the 70s, and we throw our hands, but man, these human beings are so complicated, it's going to take us some time, but don't worry, we'll get it down eventually, but we need to come up with more sophisticated models, right? That's the mentality. And whereas in physics, there seems to be this definite stream of uninterrupted progress, that it's never that there could be a retrogression where we could lose knowledge of physics, that the next generation of physicists is always better than the previous one, whereas in economics, that's not necessarily the case, where you could, and you're laughing, but even among mainstream economists, I think there's that recognition that they could think, yeah, we kind of went down a dead end with this certain type of theory, and we shouldn't have taken that fork in the road, whereas that doesn't happen so much in the natural sciences. And so, the reason they think that happens is just that, well, our discipline, the social sciences, is much more complicated. We don't have atoms and inanimate objects running around. We've got people making these decisions, and so it's just a lot more complex. But the same techniques would still work. That's the mentality. So that leads into the next difference, that the Austrians, and just so you don't get confused, the left side is always going to be what the Austrian position is, and the right side's the Neoclassical. So the next bullet point, I'm going to have to be... What's that?
Shouldn't we be on
yes, Marx wants to know if they should be on the right. Well, no, because we don't like the left versus right spectrum. Imaginary constructs versus models, and I'm reading these because people upstairs, I noticed, they can't see what I'm pointing to, so I'm going to try to at least keep them in mind. So this next bullet point is imaginary constructs versus models. So here, let me talk about the neoclassical position first, because that flows from what I was just talking about. So this is really a huge difference. If you pour through Man, Economy, and State or Human Action, and then you look through neoclassical textbooks or a journal and the articles there, the one thing that's really going to jump out at you, besides the fact there's a bunch of math in the neoclassical stuff with symbols, Greek symbols, literally Greek symbols, is that they have models. And so it's not that there's this one coherent body of economic principles that they apply to all these different topics, so much as they have different models for each area. So in international trade, you have a bunch of competing models that you've got. These guys, these co-authors here have their model where they focus on certain aspects of international trade and they reach certain conclusions. But then Samuelson has his model where he assumes something a little bit different and he gets the complete opposite result. And you have these guys over here and they have their model, and this is all just about international trade. And then, you want to talk about labor? Well, then we've got these other class of models, and this guy's got his model and he's got his model, and so on. And education or whatever, they have just different models, and depending on what you, as the economists, think is the most relevant or salient feature of that issue in the real world, that's probably going to determine which model you choose as the one that you think, this best captures what's going on out in the real economy. And again, this flows naturally from their methodology, their view of positivism, that, let me just put it this way, a quick and glib critique of the mainstream is to say, you guys are crazy, you have these models that are completely unrealistic. For example, and this is true just so you have an understanding, when I was in graduate school just a few years ago, the baseline macro model, so that we want to understand what would happen if the Fed doubles the rate of money supply or the money growth in the money supply or something like that, that type of question, how do we deal with that? Well, they say, okay, let's have a model where there's a central bank and there's one representative agent who stands for the entire economy. So one individual with one utility function, and that thing represents all the consumers. And it lives forever, has perfect foresight, is perfectly rational, can make expert calculations, and then also is totally aware of what the Fed's policy is. And then let's go ahead and solve that model with one assumed rule for the Fed, and then we'll change the rule and then see what happens in that new outcome. And if we like the new outcome better, then we'll say we think the Fed ought to do the second alternative. All right, so of course you could say to these people, well, don't you think that that's an unrealistic model, that really there's not just one person in the economy who lives forever and has perfect foresight? And they would say, sure, we know that, but you're being ridiculous, that the actual world is a very accurate model, but it's too complicated. We know all the things that actually go on in the real world, but we can't possibly take into account all of those at the same time. And so what do? We abstract away from all of what we hope are superfluous issues for the matter of the Fed's rule for money growth, and then we're just going to focus on this one issue, or a few issues, in the fictitious world of our model, where we get rid of all those complicating factors. We can clearly see what happens, other things equal, if we change the rate of money growth, let's say. And does that improve welfare or not? And if it works out in the model like that, then we can think, well, maybe it works like that in the real world, so long as the stuff we've left out of the model doesn't completely offset it. And they would make appeal to the natural sciences and say, look, if we want to put a man on the moon, the equations that NASA planners use in order to calculate the trajectory and how much fuel do we need and things like that, they're not exactly accurate. So even if they take into account air friction and things like that, they don't actually take into account the true surface of the space shuttle or the rockets as they're sitting on the launch pad. They have a rough model of it on paper, and they make it as accurate as possible, but if you took a microscope out and looked at the actual dimensions of the rocket that they're going to try to send to the moon, it's not exactly what they have on the piece of paper. But the point is, it's close enough that it's going to get us to the moon. All right, so that the projections using what we think of the laws of physics on the paper and the inputs we put in to say, oh, the astronauts weigh such and such. Just to give you an example, I want you to understand this point in case I lost you. So they need to know how much the astronauts weigh before they put them in the rocket and figure out how much fuel they need. Well, suppose 2 weeks before one guy was really sick and he was throwing up a lot, maybe he's going to weigh a little bit less. They're not going to just scrap the mission and say, oh no, because the assumptions we put into our model were wrong, therefore, for all we know, we're going to hit ignition and nothing's going to happen. They're going to say, no, that little change, that difference in what we put into the equations and the predicted output on paper, that we're going to get to the moon and be able to get you guys back, that's not going to change because you were sick 2 weeks ago, so don't worry about it. So that's their mentality, and they're going to say, yeah, there is more than one person in the economy, but don't worry about it. For the issue we're trying to focus on, we can neglect those other things. And if you, the critic, think that there is a problem, then you can come up with your model, and you can add in these other complicating factors that I'm leaving out of mine, and if you get the opposite result, then by all means, write up your results and send it into the journal, and then we can have scholarly debates over that. Okay, so that's the mentality. So in contrast, the Austrians, well, first of all, they don't really have different models, right? That there's a sense in which Austrian economists think there's a general body of economic theory that can be applied to labor markets and to international trade and what have you, and that it's not that you need different assumptions to focus in on one particular issue. All right, so it really, the closest thing I can think of is that you can have Hayekian triangles. Okay, so Roger Garrison's lecture with the thing that was in the top left there with the Hayekian triangles. But even there, it's not that Hayek was making up his model of the economy. That was just a graphical illustration of the structure of production. So if you wanted to resurrect that or to say what would that be in terms of a model, you would say, well, it's Menger's model that he thinks there's a structure of production in different orders of goods, that there's first order goods and second order and so on, and that would be the closest thing. But you can see, well, that's pretty realistic as far as I'm concerned. That's much more realistic than the fact that you assume that there's one consumer, let's say. Okay, so what do I mean by an imaginary construct? Well, that's actually what Peter Klein was just talking about, the evenly rotating economy, the ERE would be the prime example of that. So even there, it's not that Mises said, well, I have a model of the economy in which there is no uncertainty. That's not really an accurate description. It's more that he's saying, I'm picturing the real world and all of its complexity, but suppose we just stopped all of these new changes, these things that people might not have anticipated, and just let the system work its way through, and then what would we end up with? We would end up with the evenly rotating economy. So maybe, if you want to put it this way, it's that Mises is taking away one feature of the real world and then saying what's going to happen to everything else, and that's the evenly rotating economy, if the thing that we take away is uncertainty. Okay, so I just mentioned this and put these two side by side because a lot of times if you read Austrian justifications for the use of imaginary constructs, a lot of their rhetoric is going to sound very similar to the mainstream justification of using unrealistic models. And I don't want to dwell too much on this point. I do think there's a distinction. And again, Roderick Long's talks later in this week, if you're interested in this, I think would shed more light on if you want to be a Misesian and you want to use the ERE, but you still want to be able to make fun of Paul Samuelson's models, then you have to be very clear on, okay, I can say this, but I don't want to say this argument because then I'd be contradicting myself. All right, so that's the difference there. Okay, the next point is causality versus equilibrium determination. So what I mean here is that in Austrian economics, there's this sense of cause and effect, that we have things that we want to explain, and we want to say, what is the cause of those market phenomena? So in particular, the very important thing for economics is market prices. So what causes market prices? Why do we even have them? What are they? And what sort of factors influence their relative size? And of course, the Austrian answer to that question of market prices is that it's determined by subjective valuations. Just to quickly repeat what I said earlier, that a price is just an exchange ratio. If we're talking about money prices, then it's the exchange ratio of real goods on one side versus units of money on the other. And to explain in the first instance why does that happen, you would say, well, it's because of reverse valuations, that the person giving up A for B values B more than A, and the person on the other side values the opposite, and that's why they do it. And then I think you've already heard the Austrian explanation of how you can pin down what the equilibrium prices would be in an economy with people with different value scales and different endowments of goods. And so that's, but for this point right here, I want to stress that the Austrians do think something causes market prices. Or to give you a better example, when you ask an Austrian economist, why is there interest? He would say, oh, interest is caused by or is due to time preference. And so you have time preference first, and then that is what causes there to be positive interest rates. In contrast to that, the neoclassical mainstream, they don't like that language, and they really can't talk like that because they use models. So what do I mean by that? That if you say to a mainstream economist, why is the price such and such, they're not going to say, oh, it's caused by the fact that those individuals have those reverse valuations. They're going to say, because look, I can show you the conditions that are necessary for equilibrium in this model, and we have to solve the model, and there we go. The equilibrium pops out, that these are the prices, these are what prices would need to be in order for there to be equilibrium. And so if we're going to focus on equilibrium states, then there you go, that's what the prices have to be. So it's a different type of argument, and I'm not putting words in their mouth, because I gave a talk at NYU in the Austrian colloquium there about time preference and interest rates, and I invited a general equilibrium theorist to the talk, and afterward he was telling me, yeah, you guys, he said, yeah, it was very interesting, but you guys were talking about, what really causes interest. Is it capital productivity or is it time preference? And that doesn't even make sense. You have your model, and you know that in equilibrium the interest rate has to be equal to both the marginal product of capital and the marginal rate of substitution of present for future goods. And so this idea of what causes the other doesn't make any sense. And Alfred Marshall, who could be considered one of the main founders of modern neoclassical economics, he has this famous discussion where he's talking about, okay, look, the classical economists were wrong because they focused too much, almost exclusively, on the cost side or the supply side of market prices. That the reason things cost what they do, well, let's consider it from the producer's point of view. And well, yeah, he needs to charge $5 for that cup of coffee or else he's going to go out of business, so that's why it costs that. Whereas, and I'm being Marshall still, whereas in contrast, after 1871, people like Jevons in particular were so disgusted with that way of thinking that they went too far the other way, and they thought everything was about subjective preferences, about the demand side. And the reason that coffee costs what it does, or its price is what it is that consumers value it so highly, and they get a certain amount of utility. And so Marshall said, but no, you can't look at the two in isolation. There's obviously an interaction. So just if you had a supply and demand diagram, if you're familiar with that, Marshall's point is simply, if you want me to tell you why is the equilibrium price what it is, it would be silly to say, oh, it's because of the supply curve, or, oh, no, it's because of the demand curve, that you need the two together to know where the intersection point is. And so Marshall says that to ask which side determines prices is like asking which blade of the scissors does the cutting, when in fact it's both blades of the scissors that do the cutting. Okay, so that's the neoclassical view. Another analogy, and I forget who said this, but one person said that to the neoclassical view of price formation and how all the variables in the system, it's not that one causes the other, but that they're mutually determined by the equilibrium conditions. It's sort of like if you had a glass full of marbles or a bowl full of marbles, and it would be silly to point to one of those marbles and say, what's causing its position to be right there? Which of the other marbles is causing it to be there? That wouldn't really make sense. And so they said, no, really what happens is, given the nature of the marbles and the constraints that they're in that bowl in the original arrangement, that you just know once they stop rolling around and settle down, their position is going to be determined by the system as a whole, and that it really doesn't make sense to say which marble caused the other one to be there. They all together, you throw them into the system and out pops the equilibrium. All right. Let me quickly just give you, this is going to get a little bit more technical, so if you lose me, don't worry about it, but for those of you who are studying economics, let me just make this point, that the way a neoclassical model really works is they have what's called the exogenous features or parameters, so things like the technology, the production functions, as Peter Klein explained, and people's utility functions or their preferences, and the resource endowments. And then, given those fixed things, so exogenous meaning it's from outside the system, that the person building the fictitious model just plugs that stuff in, and then given that, then they say, okay, what do prices need to be in order for the system to be in equilibrium? And that's the way you solve the model, is to compute the equilibrium system of prices. And so what that means is, what do the prices have to be so that everybody is happy making the buying and production decisions that are consistent with those prices? And if everything all checks out and quantity demanded equals quantity supplied for all the markets, then there you go, that's equilibrium. And so the prices are formed endogenously, meaning within the system. Okay, so again, in that framework, it doesn't really make sense to say, well, what causes the interest rate to be 5%, or why is it positive? They would just say, well, I can explain to you the entire setup of the model, and then you can see it has to be positive because of these equations, and there's no other thing it could be. So notice that a neoclassical is very uncomfortable talking about positions outside of equilibrium, because they really it's hard to get this across without showing you a model, and I don't want to do that because I would lose most of you. But given the way these models work, you really can't do too much except to just solve it and say, okay, what would the equilibrium be when everything else settles down? You really can't talk about how does equilibrium achieved, because that sort of thing isn't in the model. It's not specified. It just says, well, this is what people do. Because what happens is, technically, you get paradoxical things where if there's an arbitrage opportunity, for example, if something is selling over here at $5 and it's selling over here for $6 and there's no cost of transportation, well, then what's the optimal thing to do? You want to buy an infinite amount of this and sell it over here, and you make an infinite amount of money. All right, so that's what the optimizing agent does in the model. So you can't really talk about that. You need to say, well, if there's no cost of production, then the price here has to be the same as the price here. Otherwise, there'd be an arbitrage opportunity. So let's get rid of all those. What do the prices need to be all over the place so there are no such opportunities where someone can make an infinite amount of money? Okay, so that's the sort of reasoning by which they say the market would quickly adjust to get rid of those things. And incidentally, that's one feature of neoclassical economists in contrast to the various Keynesian schools, where, and so I'm using neoclassical to exclude most Keynesians, that they do think, neoclassicals do think that prices float freely and that markets clear instantaneously. All right, so it's actually ironic that the Austrians are critical of Keynesians, because Keynesians often assume that the wage rate just gets stuck at a disequilibrium value. But on the other hand, Austrians are also critical of certain neoclassical approaches where they assume that wage rates and other prices just adjust instantaneously and that no one needs to perceive that discrepancy, that it's just magic, the system does it automatically. All right, let me speed up because I want to leave time for questions at the end, as I said. Okay, so the next point is strong versus weak, methodological individualism and subjectivism. So that last phrase has some intimidating words in there, but all that really means, when we say methodological, we mean that as opposed to political or ethical. Okay, so when we say the Austrians are methodological individualists, we just mean that the atom, the unit of analysis, is the individual. When we want to explain how does a recession happen, ultimately our answer had better be able to be traced back to the decisions of individuals. You don't just want to talk about, well, there's these macro variables that have certain relationships, and that's the end of the story. Ultimately, you should be able to trace it back to individuals. In methodological subjectivism, that means that these individuals, in principle, have different preferences, different values, and so it's not that something is $5 because that's its intrinsic worth. No, it's $5 because of the interaction of various people's subjective preferences. So now, why am I saying strong versus weak? Because if you said that, and when I was a student in undergraduate, Richard Ebling was my professor, and that was one of the things he said right in the beginning was Austrian Economics is based on methodological individualism, subjectivism, and that's certainly true. But if a mainstream neoclassical heard that, they would say, well, so are we. We believe in that stuff too. And so that's why I'm saying strong versus weak, is that the Austrians take these things much more seriously or much further than most neoclassicals do. That, just to give you a quick example, things I mentioned earlier, the macro model where there's one representative agent who stands for the entire economy vis-a-vis the Federal Reserve, the mainstream economist would say, yeah, see, we're not relying on these aggregate macro variables the way crude Keynesians did back in the 50s. We've got people optimizing and forming consumption decisions and picking their optimal consumption path and rationally trying to predict the Fed behavior. And so we're individualists too, but it's making the entire economy one person. So you can see that even though they, formally speaking, adhere to these things, it's not in the same sense as the Austrians. And as far as the subjectivism, not so much the Austrian economists associated with the Mises Institute, but people associated with NYU and GMU, in particular the followers of Ludwig Lockman, they call themselves radical subjectivists to contrast their position with that of the mainstream. So what their view is, very quickly, is they're going to say, yeah, sure, the mainstream models have agents who have utility functions that could in principle be different. And so it would make sense to say this guy over here really likes apples versus oranges, and this person likes oranges versus apples. So yes, value is subjective. But once you specify what their preferences are, they're just robots in the model. They just mechanically crank out their optimum consumption and work behavior and go out and do things as the model forces them to. Whereas we really believe in free will, and that people, not only are their preferences subjective, but their expectations about the future and what they do about their preferences and expectations and so on. Okay, so that's just another contrast. So that's what I mean by strong versus weak. Now, just so you don't think I am stacking the deck against the mainstream, the next point is weak versus strong rationality. So this is a point where the Austrians have a much weaker notion than the mainstream in terms of what does this term rational mean. So the Austrians, all they mean by that when they say that people are rational, that human action is rational, all that means is action is conducted for a reason. So a typical example, you've got somebody who's jumping around out in front of his field, and you say, what are you doing? And he said, oh, well, it hasn't rained in such a long time, my crops are withering, so I'm doing a dance to make it rain. All right, so there's the colloquial sense in which we want to say, oh, that's crazy, that's irrational. But no, that's a legitimate human action in the praxeological sense. It just means he has a reason for doing what he does. And actually, Mises points out that the term rational action is pleonastic. And you say, what does that mean? You have to go in the dictionary and find out what that word means. And he means that it's redundant, that you don't need, that if it's an action, it's not, of course it's rational, that it doesn't even make sense to talk about an irrational action. If somebody were doing something that wasn't rational, that wasn't for a reason, then it wouldn't be an action. Okay, so again, I'm repeating points you've already heard, but just to reiterate that when praxeology talks of action, it doesn't mean any behavior whatsoever that human beings exhibit. It means conscious, purposeful behavior. So again, different example, the doctor hits your knee with the hammer and your leg flies up. You didn't choose to do that. You chose to sit there and let him hit you, perhaps, instead of grabbing his hand. But the fact that your leg flew up was probably a reflex on your part. All right, and so you didn't choose to do that, so that's not an action in the praxeological sense. Okay, on the other hand, the mainstream neoclassicals, when they say in our models we assume people are rational, they really do mean our people are smart. They don't do stupid things like rain dances if we don't believe in the technology of moving your body to make precipitation occur. So and then there's also different schools. Robert Lucas, he inaugurated what's called rational expectations, and that, so let me back up. So rational in the old sense before Lucas in a mainstream model just meant that the agent in the model, they knew their utility functions and they knew calculus, that they knew, given the prices, this is how I optimize. And it would be silly. You would never say in class, well, you know, it took me 2 years to get to the point where I know how to solve this model. How do we know that Joe Sixpack out there, when he decides how much to buy, can do the same thing? Is he taking advanced linear algebra? And that's a silly question. They say, no, the agents in our model are rational. And the justification for that I think David Friedman's the one where I read this one. He said, yeah, we know people in the real world aren't supercomputers, but look, if we're going to assume everybody's rational and that they're not going to make mistakes in calculation, that given the market prices, they know what the optimal thing to do is given their own subjective preferences. If we didn't assume that, then anything could happen. How do you model error that you really can't deal with that? Anybody could do anything. Whereas if we assume everybody's perfectly rational, then given the rest of the system, we can at least come up with a meaningful prediction. So this is all going back to that methodological difference, that if you think the way to learn knowledge in economics, to discover economic laws, is to come up with artificial false assumptions about human behavior in the hopes that the predictions you glean from that are close enough to the real world that it sheds some light on it, that it's better than nothing. If that's your view of what economics is, then you can understand where David Friedman is coming from, that, yeah, of course we're going to assume people are supercomputers because over time there's an evolutionary process. Firms that made mistakes in their calculations would go out of business. So at any given time, yeah, it's safe to say that all the firms in existence do that which really is in their best interest in terms of profitability, even though we know there are people out there who make mistakes. Okay, and then, as I say, there's an even stronger version of this, which is called rational expectations, where the assumption is, okay, people, they don't necessarily have perfect knowledge of the future, which is what was true in the old models, but they at least understand the model that they're in. So when you're writing a neoclassical model, and you have the Fed has this behavior, and consumers do this, and the capital stock moves according to this equation, right now, if you had a model where you got your result because the agent in the model thought the capital technology was a different equation, and you sent it off to a journal, they would just reject it and say that's crazy. Over time, agents would know the technology for the capital stock. And so, no, rewrite your model and make sure all the agents in your model understand how the model works, or else these results are crazy. They violate rational expectations. Okay, so that's another difference between the two. Okay, just to pace yourself, I have 2 more points that I'll do very quickly, and then I'll leave the rest for questioning. So the second last point is strong versus weak ordinalism, and this refers to utility theory. And so that word ordinalism is in contrast to cardinalism. So here, again, just quickly, the Austrian view that they think utility is in terms of ordinal preference rankings. In particular, it doesn't make sense to say that something is 33% better than something else. All you can do is say, I prefer X to Y, but it makes no sense to talk about the degree of the preference. And the way I like to illustrate that to my classes is just to say, in terms of friendship, that, yeah, there's such a thing as friendship, and you could even imagine ranking your friends and saying, oh, my best friend is Jim, and my second best friend is Mary, and so Jim is a better friend than Mary. And you might even say there's more friendship between Jim and me than there is between Mary and me, but it wouldn't make any sense to say Jim is a 42.7% better friend than Mary, right? And it's funny and whatever, but why is that true? It's because there's no unit of friendship. It's no cardinal thing. It's not that Jim has 847 units of friendship and Mary has 64 or whatever. It's just that there's this thing, and so it really does make sense. It means something real to say Jim is a better friend, but it doesn't mean anything to push it beyond that. Where now, if you you have to be careful if you go around saying mainstream economists believe in cardinal utility, because look at their models, they have cardinal utility functions. They have, if you haven't seen them, things like, let's say there's apples and oranges. They can say, oh, the consumer, let's suppose that U equals 10A plus 4O to the 1/2 power or something. And what that means is, oh, you plug in where A equals how many apples they get and O equals how many oranges, and you get some number. And so then the agent's job or task in the model is, given the prices and my income, I want to make that U as big as possible. I want to maximize utility. And so look, it's a cardinal function, and so they really do believe in cardinal utility, right? And you just have to be careful, because technically they would say, no, we don't. And in this introductory level lecture, I'm not at all going to be able to get into what the reasoning is, but I just want to point out they think that they really do just believe in ordinal preferences, and then they have certain theorems where you can assign somebody a cardinal utility function so that when the person uses calculus to maximize it, they're doing that which they would do if you just did the Austrian ordinal preference selection. And so that there's no meaning to saying 400 utils versus 5 utils. It's just a mathematical shorthand. But again, that's beyond the scope of this lecture. But I say weak ordinalism because it's certainly, notwithstanding that, certainly the average neoclassical economist, especially who's not versed in those particular theorems from utility theory, they certainly would slip up and loosely say things that imply they believe in cardinal utility. So I don't want to defend them too much on that point. Okay, and then the last point, and then I'll open it up for questioning, it has to do with welfare theory. And so it's after Rothbard, the Austrians generally believe in what's called demonstrated preference versus Pareto, or sometimes Kaldor-Hicks efficiency. And so Rothbard's view very quickly is just that whenever there's a voluntary exchange, as economists, even being value-free ourselves, we can say in some loose sense that social happiness has gone up, meaning not that there's such a thing as total social happiness, but that those two individuals are better off because they agreed to do something. They wouldn't have agreed to do it if they didn't think it would make each of them better off. And so that's the sense in which the market is the totality of all such voluntary exchanges, if you want to use this language, maximizes social utility. So Rothbard's point is, if you want to make statements like that at all you can do is say the free market is the way to go. That's the only thing you can say and be scientifically accurate. The mainstream, on the other hand, has different notions, and this is what they mean by efficiency. So when a mainstream economist says, oh, this market outcome is inefficient, they mean according to either the Pareto criterion or the Kaldor-Hicks. And because we're short on time, let me just tell you what the Pareto is, because they're different criteria. So the Pareto is after the economist Pareto, and it just says that, look, something is inefficient, is Pareto inefficient, if given the technology and the resources and everybody's preferences, if we can rearrange the whole system of production and allocation of final goods to make every single person better off according to his or her own subjective preferences. So if we can do that, then clearly the status quo is bad or inefficient, because every single person would agree with us that this alternative possibility is better. All right, so that's the Pareto criterion for efficiency. So it's not so much that it's saying a Pareto efficient outcome is good, but rather a Pareto inefficient outcome is bad. Okay, so I will stop there and open it up for questions. Yeah.
What's the biggest difference I've seen between Austrianism and Neoclassical in my school, besides the linear algebra and differential equations, is also indifference curves. And I guess what's your take on indifference? I know that's not possible under Austrianism, but do you think that's a big critique you have of the Neoclassical?
Okay, the question had to do with what's the Austrian view on indifference curves. Let me just quickly, in case you don't know what he's talking about, and also I want to be able to draw on this. Okay, so the indifference curves look something like this, and the idea is that this is apples and that's oranges. Then each of these points in the xy plane are different bundles. So this bundle represents that many apples and that many oranges, and this one over here represents this many apples and that many oranges. And so these lines, these indifference lines, connect bundles of equal utility, and hence this person who has these curves would be indifferent between any of these bundles on each of these lines. And then as you move up, you're better off, assuming that you like apples and oranges, because you're getting more of both. It's the actual principles involved, and this is why the mainstream thinks they believe in ordinal utility. There's no sense, it doesn't really make sense to say, oh, all these points give 100 utils, and these ones give 240, and so on, that you don't need to do this. You can just talk about strictly ordinal preferences or indifference, that, yep, that point right there, that's strictly better than anything on this line down here, and that it's a pairwise comparison for each of the points involved. And so that's why the mainstream economist thinks, look, we can do our optimizing decisions. I could put the price line on here and figure out where this agent would spend his money between apples and oranges, and nowhere have I said anything about cardinal utility. So again, not to confuse you, I'm saying that doesn't make any sense, or you don't need to assume that sort of relationship. But at the same time, there's a bunch of hidden assumptions, in particular that the apples and oranges are infinitely divisible. Okay, so to draw these smooth lines, it's not that you could say 5 apples versus 4 oranges, but you also have to be able to talk about 5.00074 apples versus 2.6664 oranges, okay, to be able to graph all these points. And so that's one of the major objections that Rothbard brings up, is that human action is always over finite units. And even if you're talking about something like flour, where you could have very finely divisible units, still there's a point at which acting human beings aren't going to distinguish between 1/billionth more of an ounce or 1/billionth less. And so these things really are also packed with unrealistic assumptions. Other questions? Yeah.
As far as the rationality, talks about a pool player where we're not necessarily rational, but we act that way. Is that how we respond to that as far as strong?
Right. Okay, so the question was referring to Milton Friedman's got a famous example where he says to defend the, I think beyond just rationality, it's the point of unrealistic assumptions. He says, look, if we're talking about an expert pool player and he's lining up and he's about to take his next shot, and we've just seen this guy for the past 3 weeks and he always knocks in easy shots, let's say, that we can, if we wanted to predict where the cue ball is going to go, we could use physics and say, okay, given the laws of physics, what would the momentum have to be, and so on, and how much would he have to push this stick in order to make the ball knock in the desired ball into the proper pocket. And then let's just assume it's as if that pool player knows all of those laws as well, and he's going to do that which, using our knowledge of physics, we computed on a piece of paper as this is the optimal thing for him to do with his body. And the point is, Friedman says that it's not that the pool player actually needs to have studied physics at the college level and knows all that stuff. Perhaps he uses some completely different technique by which he knows, oh, I got to hit the ball just this way in order to sink it. So what's my quick answer to that? Well, I'll take the easy way out first and say I think that's exactly the sort of thing Roderick Long is going to talk about later in this week. But I guess my answer is I would recommend that you go, if you haven't read Hans Hoppe's Economic Science and the Austrian Method, I think is the name of the pamphlet. There's a pamphlet out here, and then it's also online. And there, it's more than just a matter of prediction, and it has to do with this fundamental distinction between things of mental phenomena and physical phenomena. And so there's really, let me just, in the last few seconds, it's not so much that we assume that I attribute intentionality to all of you guys, and I think that you actually are conscious beings and have motivations just because, oh, that helps me get through life more easily. It seems like there's something involved that's more than just that. It's true if I didn't think that, if I treated you the same way I treat inanimate objects, then I also would be very unsuccessful with my goal. I would make horrible predictions all the time, and I wouldn't understand the behavior of these fleshy things that move around in such weird patterns. But it's more than just that. So what I'm getting at is Friedman's analysis begs the question. He assumes that prediction is the ultimate test of whether a theory is good or bad, and so if you don't subscribe to that, then his analogy isn't a good one.
Thank you
Thanks.
very much, Bob.